So for those of you who don't know much about me, I'm a nutritional scientist, functional integrative practitioner, nutrigenomics practitioner. Um, and I'm really, really passionate about kind of evidence-based science and nutrition. I've been training in this for a very long time. I actually went to medical school to become an oncologist. My mother had breast cancer, and I realized that I didn't necessarily want to go into oncology, but I really wanted to help cancer patients. So I worked in research for a while, and then 20 years ago, I did my master's in nutritional medicine. So I really got into nutrition and lifestyle very early on because we already had some evidence and data by then looking at nutrition and lifestyle and how it reduces the risk of cancer reoccurrence. So I'm very, that's very important to me. Some of you might know I've also had breast cancer. I was 29 when I was first diagnosed with breast cancer. We do have a family history. We don't have any of the known genes. I have had 2 local reoccurrences since. I have followed my own advice, but I also had I didn't have much treatment. I didn't have radiotherapy or chemotherapy, so it was all very local in the skin. And so I really understand what it's like to reduce your risk of breast cancer if that's in your family, but also as a survivor. I am going to do a slightly different presentation next week for those of you who've had breast cancer, and I will be sharing more about that later in the week. I'm also very passionate about health inequalities in cancer because sadly people from marginalized groups do have poorer outcomes. So let's move on. Oops. Here we go. So just a quick recap. What is breast cancer? So our breasts are made up of milk glands and ducts, which produce the milk and carry it to the nipple. And basically, we have these lobules and we also have these glands, these ducts. The cancer normally forms in the glands or the ducts. This is because the cells grow out of control, and that's what cancer is. It forms a tumor. We know that in breast cancer and some other cancers, hormones can influence the development of these breast cancers, and there are lots of other different risk factors, which we're going to talk more about today. So there are lots of risks for breast cancer, some of which we can modify, and some of which we can't change. So what people don't realize, even though there's so much in the news, is that actually age and gender are 2 of the biggest risk factors. So at least 80% of the cases of breast cancer developing those over the age of 50, and that's often postmenopausal. And obviously breast cancer is more likely if you're a woman. And that's not to say that men don't get it. Men have breast tissue too, but it's definitely more common as women. And then other things that we cannot change which influence our risk for breast cancer, things like being a greater weight at birth. If you're a bigger baby, you're more likely to have breast cancer. We think that might be something to do linked with a growth factor. If you're a taller person, again, same thing. Again, we think it might be the link with growth factor. Our family history, like many of us have family histories of all sorts of different types of diseases. And with breast cancer, if we have a family history, like maybe my family, then we know there may be something there that increases our risk of breast cancer, but we don't fully understand that. What's interesting now about looking at women who have had younger breast cancer is there's something called SNPs. SNPs are single nucleotide polymorphisms. They're very small genomic changes. We all have them. Absolutely everybody has them in all the genes. So you can have ones which are more normal, ones which are less normal, and ones which are beneficial, ones which are less beneficial. And that can potentially, families which have had younger breast cancer have maybe got mutations of 300 or so different ones of these SNPs. So that's something that we're learning about. And when we have the family younger women breast cancer conference 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, there was some really interesting research that was shared about that. And these genetic mutations can include gene mutations such as BRCA1 and 2, which many have heard of, which increases your risk of not just breast cancer, but other cancers, including ovarian cancer. One thing that a lot of people don't know about is the age of your menarche, the age that you started having your periods. That can also influence your risk. So if you start at a younger age, you're more likely to have more cycles, and that can increase your risk. I actually started my cycle at 11, which is relatively young, so that is potentially a risk factor. And also if you have later menopause, that also can influence your risk. So if you have a later menopause, again, you have more cycles, particularly if you haven't been pregnant. And then if you have dense breasts, many of us can't change our breast density. We're learning so much more about this, and we're understanding that hormones, exogenous hormones, things like HRT and the pill can potentially change the density of a breast, and potentially even environmental estrogens too. something we don't know much about. But then there are other things that we can change or we have a little bit more control over, which can also influence our risk of breast cancer. So physical activity, if we do less exercise, and this is actually not linked to, well, there is a link potentially to your body weight, but there's a whole other area of physical activity which isn't linked to our body weight. And I will touch on this today, but I don't have time to go into kind of the potential mechanisms. And we don't actually understand all of the mechanisms yet. Being overweight, sadly, or obesity, particularly for postmenopausal women, is actually slightly protective for premenopausal women, but for postmenopausal women, that's probably because the body fat can also produce some forms of estrogen after you've had menopause. Drinking alcohol, any alcohol at all increases your risk of breast cancer, and I'll talk more about all of this. Your reproductive history. So if you have not had children or given birth by the age of 30, well, no, let me rephrase that. If you have not been pregnant before the age of 30 or had a baby, that can increase your risk. Breastfeeding reduces your risk of breast cancer. The reproductive history sounds really interesting because obviously our whole world is completely changed. So we need to understand more about that. But we do think, again, when you're pregnant, you're not having your cycle. So that's part of it. And then taking hormones, HRT, there's so much controversy about this, but there was a very discredited women's health study, which, back in 2002, which meant a whole generation of women didn't have HRT. We know that it can sometimes slightly increase the risk for some people, not everybody. And I do think HRT is a really important tool within the managing menopause. And oral contraceptives, so that's the pill, taking the pill can potentially increase our risk of breast cancer. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't take it. It's just to understand it and look at our family history. And then smoking increases your risk. But did you know that if you smoked when you started your period, that actually increased your risk a little bit more? So we know that smoking increases the risk of many cancers. It's one of the behavior and lifestyle risks that we are linked to lots of different cancers, but smoking, particularly when you start your period, can actually increase your risk of breast cancer. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit more about the risks, including going a little bit more into nutrition and lifestyle, including physical activity. I cannot cover everything today. So I'm going to try and cover as much as possible in the time that we have, and that I do want to have a good 8 to 10 minutes left for questions. You can put just questions in the chat so that we can make sure that we pick them up as we go along. And I'll obviously read through the chat later on. So all the data we have about nutrition and lifestyle, it doesn't just come from like, oh, we're guessing. We've actually looked, and the World Cancer Research Fund, which is one of the biggest kind of institutions looking into nutrition and lifestyle, and the World Health Organization, they found that nutrition, your diet, your physical activity, and your lifestyle can be linked to, it's a determinant of cancer. So 30 to 40 cases of all cancers, there is a link. That doesn't mean it gave you cancer. There just is a link. We know that premenopausal breast cancer, postmenopausal cancer have slightly different risk factors, and I'm going to talk to you about those. I'm particularly interested in younger women and premenopausal breast cancer. That means I'm equally interested in older women too, but there's a few slight differences. Given that I had breast cancer age 29 when I was very lean, doing triathlons, knew what I was eating, so I'd already done my master's in nutritional medicine and was very health conscious. I think there's loads of other things I'm not going to get a chance to talk to today about, like sleep, stress management, our social health, environment, and toxins, but they're definitely things that potentially could be linked. But the research that we're looking at when it comes to the nutrition and kind of physical activity, it comes from a vast number of studies, including over 12 million women. And over 260,000, I've just noticed there's a zero missing, cases of breast cancer. So really important. And actually this document, which was revised in 2018, actually they've just had literally released a new document, which I need to digest still, which only came out literally about a week ago. So I want to talk about body fat because it's something that comes up all the time. We know that if you have increased body fat, and I really want to be careful of, rather than using weight, like with weight, we're looking at BMI. BMI was really based on white men, and it's not appropriate for a lot of women, or any women really. But when we look at body fat, we know that if you're premenopausal, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, it actually kind of reduces your risk. And we don't really know why this is. But if you're postmenopausal, having extra body fat can increase your risk of breast cancer. And there's 3 different reasons why we think this might be. So one is, as I shared earlier, body fat produces extra estrogen, and this can increase your risk of hormone receptor positive breast cancer. We also know that if you have more body fat, you're more likely to have more inflammation. It's this low-grade inflammation, which increases the risk of breast cancer because there's more DNA damage. And then the third reason, which is, I think, fascinating, is the link to insulin resistance. Now, we know that type 2 diabetes, and I did a whole talk on this last week, if you have type 2 diabetes, this increases your risk of breast cancer between 20 to 27%. Now, diabetes is where you are not necessarily producing enough insulin, or insulin resistant. So when you eat food and you metabolize it, you need more and more insulin to break it down and to release blood glucose into your bloodstream. Now, this insulin resistance, this encourages the body to produce growth hormones. And we know that high levels of these growth hormones can increase the growth of cancer cells. So there's 3 different mechanisms, as you see, that are linked to our body fat. And I think BMI is problematic in another way, that it really takes your weight over your height. And really what we're looking at is body composition. And one of the conversations we had at the Nutritional Cancer Survivorship Conference about 3 weeks ago was that we, as scientists, are measuring BMI, or doctors are measuring BMI, yet what we really want to know is body fat. And that we can only do with a body composition machine, which actually a lot of gyms now have, and actually they have some in Boots too. And then all the other ways, a DEXA scan, which you might often use for osteoporosis, to check whether you've got osteoporosis or osteopenia. Now, this body fat, we don't know exactly what the right amount of body fat is. We do, but there is some interesting conversations happening, and this is all data that's extrapolated from type 2 diabetes, is do we as women need to have our body fat under 32%? And you know what, mine is not under 32%, and I'm working on it. But then the other thing is, we need to also think about muscle mass. Like for me, I know my muscle mass is more than normal for my age group. So something to think about is our body composition, and we definitely need to do more research, and we need to have more conversations about this. Now, just a little recap of what we know is linked to breast cancer if you're premenopausal, what the risks are. So if you look at this green box, we know that things that could potentially reduce the risk. So vigorous physical activity, and I'll talk more about this later on, body fatness, which we've just covered, and lactation, which is breastfeeding. Now, increasing the risk, your adult height can increase your risk factor. Drinking alcohol and having a greater birth weight. Obviously, these are things that we can't do much about other than drinking alcohol. So something to think about. So when we look at the data and evidence, there's some evidence that the following foods can decrease the risk of breast cancer. And it's very similar for premenopausal as it's postmenopausal, but there are some differences. So eating a high intake of non-starchy vegetables. So that's eating that rainbow of vegetables, but not things like your root vegetables, like your potatoes, your pumpkins, things like that. So those are the non-starchy vegetables, but really looking at some of these other ones. That can reduce the risk of estrogen negative breast cancer. That's breast cancer that grows, which is not hormone dependent. And that might be, we think, due to having a higher fiber diet. Now, in the UK, well, the recommendation is to eat 30 grams of fiber a day. Most women only eat 19 grams. So we're all kind of fiber deficient. And I think the thing to do is to eat at least 5 to 8 portions of fruit and vegetables each day, and to get that fiber. So yesterday, if you do follow me on Instagram, I posted a vegan noodle salad. And actually that had 17 grams of fiber. Really, but I also had 37 grams of protein, which is a lot for a vegan dish. Foods containing carotenoids. So that is all those beautiful yellow and orange foods. So things like mangoes and carrots and peaches and things like that. Mangoes actually has one of the highest number of carotenoids. So those kind of foods. Dairy products, preferably fermented. So there's so much there's a lot of discussion about dairy and breast cancer, but actually having dairy products, but fermented ones, those are like things like live yogurt, kefir, some cheeses. Actually, they're very protective of breast cancer, and they may be linked to the fact that some of the people eat those foods might have a diet that's high in calcium, but that also includes our dark leafy greens and sardines and foods, sesame seeds and things like that. Eating a portion of cruciferous vegetables. I'm obsessed with cruciferous vegetables. They are things like your broccoli, your cabbage, your cauliflower, having a portion of those is really important to reducing your risk of breast cancer. We actually know that those particular foods have got loads of anti-cancer chemicals inside them, loads of antioxidants, but they also, and loads of things which protect your DNA, but they also have different antioxidant things which actually help to bind the used estrogen in our body, in our liver, and remove it. So that's why it's such an important category of foods. And then 2 portions of dark leafy greens. Not many of us have 2 portions of dark leafy greens. In fact, I don't even think I've even had that today, but I do try most days. And then a lower glycemic index diet. That is a diet which releases blood sugar more slowly. Now, when you eat food, blood sugar glucose is released, which is normal. And it is, and I really can't stress enough how normal that is and what we need. And I don't want to talk about the glucose goddess today because there's a whole lot of controversy about that. But what we want to do is eat foods which are high in fiber, high in protein, and that reduces the glucose spike. So it releases blood glucose a little bit more slowly, and that's what a low glycemic index is. And then being vigorous, physically active might decrease the risk. I'll talk more about the physical activity in a little bit. So for postmenopausal breast cancer, you'll see in this area where it's probable decreases risk is physical activity. We know that, and we'll talk more about that. Body fatness in young adulthood. So being slightly overweight when you're a young adult as opposed to older adult. And then again, breastfeeding, and then increases risk. Alcohol, we know. Body fatness, again, it comes back that being overweight or obese in your kind of postmenopausal can increase your risk of breast cancer. Adult weight gain, that's again gaining weight as an adult, and then your height, which obviously you cannot do much about. Now, the difference that you'll see here is that it's not in postmenopausal breast cancer. Still the same high intake of non-starchy vegetables, still these foods containing carotenoids. However, we're not sure about dairy when it comes to postmenopause. We do want diets high in calcium. That does decrease your risk of breast cancer, but this having dairy, we're not sure about, which is really interesting because fermented dairy has got a really amazing, it has lots of beneficial bacteria often, which is important for gut health, and that is linked to our immune health. So something for us to research more and to learn more about. And then eating this portion of cruciferous vegetables, which I've just explained, and the leafy greens and the low glycemic index. Now, in this, it's about being physically active, but moderately physically active. And I'll share more about what that means. Now, I think the thing that people are very confused about is the sugar, and people talk about it all the time. And I just wanted to quickly touch on this. This whole relationship between sugar and breast cancer is very complex. We know that sugar and other carbohydrates, they can increase inflammation by causing blood glucose levels to increase, and they can also cause insulin levels to increase. And we know that having higher levels of insulin can be linked to cancer cell division, so cancer cells growing more quickly. We know that high carbohydrate diets can increase the amount of fat deposit in the body because they're very palatable and it's easy to eat a lot of them and not burn them off the energy, and can increase the amount of estrogen in the body, which can also trigger cell division in particular cells with the estrogen receptor. But however, there isn't no direct link between eating sugar and cancer. It's more about what happens when you eat too much and how our insulin works. So if you're insulin resistant, that's where it becomes a problem. Having a piece of cake once in a while is fine. And I think this is where we have to understand. So if you're having a low to moderate glycemic index diet where blood sugar is released a bit more slowly, that's fine. Then having a piece of cake once in a while. But if you're having a diet where you're not eating and you're missing a meal and they're suddenly having a massive meal of carbohydrates and it's getting your blood glucose kind of released very fast, that could be problematic. And I'm keeping this very basic with the science. Like dairy is definitely very, very contentious, but yeah, actually quite protective in many people. So they looked at over 1.2 million patients with breast cancer and found that, again, as I explained, with younger women, with premenopausal women, this diet high in calcium and containing dairy, particularly fermented dairy, is really protective, whereas in postmenopausal women, we just want a diet high in calcium. And a diet high in fermented dairy can reduce the risk of estrogen negative cancer. So again, we're looking at this fermented dairy, which is, you'll see here, like these yogurts and kefirs and some of these cheeses. We do know that drinking dairy milk daily has, and this was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition back in 2021, it slightly increases the risk of hormone-positive breast cancer in postmenopausal women. But again, we need to know more. Has this stopped me drinking my daily flat white? No. Is it something I want to consider changing? Absolutely, I do. Just don't like the taste of some of the other milks. So meat, fish, and breast cancer. A lot of people think that, meat and fish and all of these foods are linked to breast cancer. Now, what we do know is that having processed meat can increase our risk of breast cancer by 6%. Processed meat is things like the sausages, the cured meats, the salamis, those kind of things, bacon. We know that eating red meat may potentially slightly increase the risk, although that's also quite controversial because we know that having enough iron is really important for our body, particularly if you're still menstruating. We know that eating poultry rather than red meat decreases the risk of breast cancer. This potentially could be linked to whether we're having saturated fat or kind of higher fat diets. We know that having a very high fish consumption early adulthood to midlife can be associated with decreased risk of breast cancer. And we know there's a much lower risk of breast cancer in countries which do have a very high fish consumption, including like the Mediterranean diet. Again, this diet high in omega-3 fatty acids found in oily fish like salmon and herring and sardines and mackerel, all of those kind of fish, and having a diet rich in olive oil, part of the Mediterranean diet, can be protective against this triple negative breast cancer and support with treatment. But we don't understand why that might be fully yet. And again, having this omega-3 fatty acids protective. And I think that for most women, we do not eat enough oily fish, particularly in the UK, and we would like to supplement. We do want to supplement with a fish oil. And obviously, if you're vegan, you can have algal forms of this. Soya, soya was one of those foods that's been really, I'm just going to move this because I realize you can't actually see. I'm going to minimize you. Here we go. We know that soya is one of those foods that's been quite contentious due to these things called phytoestrogens. But soya as itself is actually a bean, and I think many people don't realize this. And it's full of protein and fiber and these phytoestrogens, which don't actually bind to the receptor in the same way, but they can be protective. So if you think about this being the estrogen receptor and this being estrogen, and that's how it binds. Now, if we have the phytoestrogens, it kind of blocks it. So that's why they can be mildly protective. We know that eating soya in our teenage years and through starting our periods is very protective, not quite as protective later in life. And that might be due to this something called estrobolome. The estrobolome is a whole kind of category of beneficial bacteria in our gut, which can metabolize estrogens. Now, we know that countries which have a lot more soya, eat a lot more soya rather, actually have slightly reduced risk of breast cancer. And this may be because they may have more of these beneficial bacteria which can metabolize estrogen. We know that eating moderate amounts of unprocessed soya, such as tofu, tempeh, miso, natto, edamame, is actually very safe for breast cancer patients, and it's protective for those who have not had breast cancer. And flax seeds, can be another form, or linseeds, again, of phytoestrogens. We want to avoid these supplements because we do know that they may be linked to increased risk of breast cancer. So alcohol, this is me drinking wine, and I wanted to show that I'm not perfect, and it's really important. And I do drink. I actually drink a lot less now, particularly I'm in that perimenopausal phase, and I really struggle. But I do drink, and we know that alcohol is metabolized in our breast tissue to this thing called acetaldehyde, which kind of is associated to DNA damage. All alcohol, drinking even one glass of alcohol increases your risk. So, but then we have to balance that out with kind of socializing and life as well too. We do know that alcohol can increase our risk levels of estrogen, which we know is a risk factor for breast cancer, and reducing alcohol consumption really can reduce the risk of breast cancer. I personally now drink probably maximum once or twice a month, and I really do think it's something to keep to remember. We also have to remember that alcohol is quite calorific, and so if you are kind of at that perimenopause, menopause bit, that you may want to reduce alcohol just to help with weight control as well. So what do we eat then? So I love the Mediterranean diet pattern. It's not just what we eat, it's how we eat. I think, and if you look at the bottom of this, it's about kind of movement and exercise at the bottom, but also people sitting together around a table and eating. And I think a lot of us don't do that any longer. And what we want to do is base our diet on large numbers of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, lots of herb salads and things like that, and then have a small amount of fish, particularly oily fish and seafood, have some poultry, eggs, cheese, and then at the very top have meats and sweets, and you'll see alcohols on the side. So these are the kind of foods we want to really focus on in that order, and making sure we have olive oil and nuts and seeds, avocado for those beneficial fats. So this is a healthy plate. You'll see here we have half the plate of having these colorful, non-starchy vegetables. We have a kind of a quarter of the plate as being our proteins. So the real range of different things. So there's beans there's fish, there's eggs. In the middle, we have healthy fats, which are really, really important. So our brain is made 60% of fat. So it's really important for our brain, and lots of other things. So olive oil, nuts, seeds, avocado, and then carbohydrate. Again, we want to really select those whole grain varieties. Eating that 2 portions of oily fish a week, and avoiding red and processed meat, particularly that's grilled or barbecued. And then from a vitamin D supplement from October to April, particularly in the UK, where we just do not make vitamin D. And actually, that's a recommendation for everyone, not just, anyone that's at risk of breast cancer. Actually, everybody really should be taking a vitamin D supplement. And many of us have mutations, genomic mutations, and we can test for all these things. I mean, I do that kind of testing because I'm a genomics practitioner, to test to see whether do you have mutations in your vitamin D transport? Do you have mutations in your vitamin D storage and utilization? So if you do, then we need to really make sure that you're having higher dose supplements. We want to support our gut health by having more plant-based foods and fermented foods and probiotics. Probiotics are foods with a live bacteria. We want to limit alcohol, reduce our free and refined sugar intake, having that lower glycemic index food, and eat unprocessed soy products, and drink at least 2 liters of water a day. So physical activity in cancer, we know that there's lots of mechanisms which link physical activity and exercise to reduce breast cancer in lots and lots of different ways. One is obviously managing body fat, but let's park that. But there's looking at estrogen levels. Physical activity can reduce our circulating estrogen levels. It can also reduce our insulin levels. So building muscle mass is really important or maintaining our muscle mass, particularly at this perimenopause, menopausal age, because muscle is essentially a buffer for insulin. The more muscle you have, the more you utilize up your blood glucose and any circulating insulin. It helps to control inflammation, our body fatness, which we discussed already, and oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is when you damage DNA. Regular and moderate exercise supports our immune function. There's so many different mechanisms to understand this, but we know that physical activity can help our immune system to work more efficiently. It helps with DNA repair. It really delays this age-related dysfunction, meaning that it delays our body function aging. And so we're able to, when we continue to exercise, we know it supports our gut health and having this beneficial bacteria. And then it also helps with this short-chain fatty acid. Short-chain fatty acid is something that's made by beneficial bacteria when they metabolize our fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds and these plant-based foods. And they actually can repair our gut cells, which line kind of the gut, and help with mechanisms for cell signaling and talking for our gut and our immune system to talk to each other. Now, how much physical activity do we actually need? So both the UK and the US recommend at least 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity. And moderate is when you're out of breath. So walking isn't really sufficient. Walking is great. It's a great way of getting movement in. It's a great way of not being sitting down. It's just, gets out into fresh air. But we need to do enough where you're out of breath and holding a conversation slightly hard. Vigorous exercise, but you're really out of breath and you just can't talk at all. And then we need to, so you could either do at least 150 minutes of this moderate or 75 minutes a week of vigorous exercise where you're out of breath, or a mixture of both. But we also need to be strength training and building this muscle or maintaining muscle. And after the age of 30, we start to make less muscle as women and men, actually. But particularly for women, and this really declines when you get through menopause. So we do want to maintain and strength train. We're never really going to be bulky. So you have to eat enough protein and you have to do enough strength train. And strength train not with light weights, but you want to be heavier weights so that you're really challenging your muscles to grow them. Now, if you're South Asian, sadly, we have a different cardiometabolic health. And that I'm not going to go into that today, but there's loads of reasons why. But we do need to counteract this cardiometabolic health. And the fact is that we are at more risk of cardiovascular disease and cancer and other type 2 diabetes, and much lower BMI, a lower weight. We do need 232 minutes a week. This equates to South Asians kind of undertaking an extra 10 to 15 minutes of kind of moderate exercise on top of the recommendations. So if you look at 150 minutes being 30 minutes a day, if you're South Asian, you need to do 40 to 45 minutes a day. Yet South Asian women are the most sedentary group in the UK. So something to think about, and something we need to address, because there are loads of barriers to exercise. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to answer the questions in a second, but I do see patients on a one-to-one basis, and you can have a free discovery call, and I'll send you those details later. But what I want to do is go to the chat and see if there's any questions. No, right. If anyone has any questions, you can take yourself off mute at this point, or you can just pop them in the chat and I can answer your questions so we can finish on time, because it is, there's no such thing as stupid question, by the way. I know today was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I didn't get a chance to talk about sleep and stress and environment and toxins, so I can quickly answer those questions. But if anyone's got any questions, pop them in the chat or take yourself off mute and we can answer those for you now. I think Julie is trying to talk, but let me ask to unmute you here. I cannot hear you. I wonder why that is. Ask to unmute.
Magic.
There we go. It's working.
That's brilliant. That was lovely. So my day job is breast screening and breast health, and I think people get so mixed up with all the messages, but it's lovely to hear. It is in a little bit the things that are in my control is more exercise and smaller portions.
Yeah, well, yes and no. We don't necessarily need smaller portions. I want everyone to have bigger portions of fruit and vegetables. So
Okay,
we'll
yeah.
say that. But I think really kind of look, I love food. I'm a real foodie. I love to cook. I love to eat. It's not easy. We are more sedentary. Our lifestyles are very different to before. But I think it's about thinking about if we start to change things. So how do we create that plate? Really focus on those half the plate of the different colored fruit and vegetables. A lot of us are eating the same 8 to 10 fruit and vegetables all year round. Really, we want to eat more seasonally, and we want to vary that and have as much of a variety and try and eat each color from the rainbow every single day. So, really having that variety on the plate, and then making sure we've got enough protein. And one of the things, and I'm having this conversation, with my poor mum, who is 75, who has survived breast cancer already for 25 years. And she is super fit, really light, but is despite training at the gym, not eating enough protein, so losing muscle mass. And that can also tip you into a pre-diabetic state, particularly for South Asians that are much low. My mum is underweight, if anything, rather than, so it's really interesting. And that's why maintaining our muscle mass or trying to build some is really, really important, because we know there's this link with we used to think that breast cancer was a genetic disease. And there is elements of genetics, but there's also a metabolic element, and we need to change that. Does that kind of help to clarify what I was trying to say?
I know. So it's eating smaller portions, but eating more of the good stuff.
Eating more of the good stuff. Yeah, and it's not about not. I always think if you focus on adding more of the good stuff, then naturally you'll be eating less of the processed stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's more positive for your mindset, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also I like eating earlier in the evening rather than later at night. I find that much easier to manage as I've got older.
Yeah, I think so, because we need time to digest. And when I talk about sleep and sleep hygiene, I really advise that everyone finishes their meal at least 3 hours before they go to bed, because that will impact the quality of your sleep. And as we get older, our quality of sleep decreases anyway. So really want to support that. It allows our body temperature to fall so we can actually sleep, and our body's not busy digesting food, and we can go into that rest and kind of recover phase. I think one of the interesting things about people who have had breast cancer is fasting overnight for 12 and a half hours actually reduces our risk of reoccurrence. And I'll be talking about that next week. But maybe all of us need to do that, but to allow our gut to repair overnight. And the problem is that we're kind of all grazing all day, and like into the evening when we're watching TV, and maybe we just need that little kind of
Break.
period of time where we allow ourselves to rest. Thank you. Any other questions? Please put them in chat. I'm actually really disappointed that so many people signed up and not many people joined live, because obviously the whole point is to answer questions. But if anyone else has got any questions, we've got 7 more minutes. So I'm really happy to answer questions. And please, if you want to put your cameras on, you're very welcome. If you don't want to, that's fine. If you want to put it in the chat, that's fine. And actually, given that we've got you, Julie, and no one else answered questions, I'm going to get you to unmute again, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And again, one of the other things I want to share about is really being breast aware. So know your own normal. Like if you are checking regularly, if you have daughters, nieces, any younger females or men, but really encourage people as soon as they start developing breasts to check their breasts. There's some really good videos on the internet. Copperfield and Breast Cancer Now have really good videos on showing you how to check your breasts. You want to use like these 3 fingers, and you want to get all up to your collarbone, and you want to be going in your armpit. So I encourage you to know your normal, because that's what helped me be diagnosed very early on. And then the other thing is,
Brilliant.
once you get over 50, please attend your routine breast screening. It's actually very low in radiation, and there's a little moment of discomfort, I'm not going to lie, but it's fast. So I don't know if you want to add anything, Julia, someone who kind of
Yeah.
does that.
So there's when I'm talking to people, people still say I'm scared of feeling because I'm frightened of what I'll find. I've started going now with the know your normal. So like when I get up in the morning, I look at my face and go, "Am I so gorgeous?" Or, "Oops, I need to go to bed earlier tonight." So know your body in the same way. So some women don't like to touch the boobs. Maybe they've lumpy breasts for whatever reason. So another way is just to look at them. So like I love to say, stand in front of a mirror in a bright room, lock the door, take your kit off, and just look at them. Raise your arms up, turn to the side and look, and just have a really good look. And if you're bigger breasted, you're going to need 2 hands to lift them up and
Done
have a
them up,
look.
yeah. TLC,
Yeah,
let's say touch, look,
look,
and what's the
check,
C? Check.
check.
And,
Yeah,
and, and that's the thing. It's about we're not looking for something that's wrong. You're just looking for what's normal.
yeah.
And I think that's the key. And if you start doing that from a younger age, then you're going to be aware. And not just your breast, like the whole of your body. I think we need to understand the same about our vulvas and our vaginas, and all the different parts of our bodies, our skin for
No,
skin cancer, all of those things. Knowing your own normal is so important.
but isn't it so we so know when our period is? We know what date it is. We always check that because it's really important for us to know what that is in our life cycles and our whatever we're up to. And yet then we forget the boobs, but because they don't just bleed every month, so you just ignore them. But yeah.
Uh,
But I always say big boobs are lovely if you're a lap dancer or a striptease artist, but really if you have small boobs, it's much easier to keep an eye on them.
It is, and I'm a bigger breasted girl, especially when I was on a smaller frame. It was, but you just have to keep checking. And I think for me, like
Yeah.
the reason I was checking from the age of 22, 23 is A, I was at medical school, but B, also because of my mum having breast cancer, I was just very, very aware. So I'm like, well, if I just keep checking, then I know what my normal is. And the lump I had, no one really believed me because I was so young, but I knew that wasn't normal for me. So just a
Correct.
little kind of reminder to A, know your normal, B, go to your routine mammograms, really, really important. And then like knowing that your diet and lifestyle is really important. And I didn't talk about sleep or stress, but we know that if we don't get enough sleep, that can impact our immune system. And if you think about our immune system being like a really great CCTV camera system, where it's roaming around our body looking for things which aren't quite right. And most of the time, our immune system catches cells which are growing out of control, which could grow into cancer. And it's actually when it's not working so well that that they are allowed to grow. And cancer cells are really sneaky and really clever, and they're really good at evading our CCTV camera system. So there's nothing that we've done wrong, but it's really good to know what can reduce your risk. I don't sit there and think, oh my God, I should have done this, I should have done that. I definitely think there's layers to understanding what your particular case is, but it's just about doing what we can do and being really aware of things that we can do, the modifiable risk, because obviously we can't change the non-modifiable risk. We can't change our birth weight, we can't change our height, we can't change, all of those sort of different things, but we can change other things. So that was
Absolutely.
really what I wanted to cover today. Has anyone else got any questions? And if not, we will leave you to get on with eating your cruciferous vegetables. If any, I will send this out as a recording for anyone who wasn't able to join us live and kind of share a little bit more information about what I do. But reminder, eat lots of different vegetables, 5 to 8 portions a day, eat the colors of the rainbow, eat your lean protein, make sure you're having omega-3, make sure you're having a vitamin D supplement. It's safe to eat soya and unprocessed soya. So the thing is that we know a lot about unprocessed soya, which is like the soya beans, which are edamame, miso, tofu, tempeh, all of those things. What we don't know enough about is the processed soya, which is in like the soya mints and the soya milks and things like that. But again, it's either protective or it does nothing, because you don't have those bacteria which metabolize soy, the estrogen, phytoestrogens in the soya. And hopefully that was helpful. Follow me on Instagram on at the Urban Kitchen. And if there's anything else, please get in touch. I'm always happy to have conversations.